In our last video, we went over how we could create a leg, a custom leg, using bones, controllers, and an IK system. And what I did between videos is I simply selected everything from this leg and copied it to make another leg. I also made sure that everything was named. So for example, left upper leg, right upper leg, so that we'll know what everything is called. And especially if someone else is going to be using this file, they don't have to go in and try to figure out what everything is. So they won't be asking, what is bone 037? Instead, they'll know right upper leg or whatever it is. Today, we're going to be going over how to create the spine. We've created the legs. We're going to work our way up. We're going to create the spine all the way up to the head. So let's get started with that. Again, I'm going to go to my Create tab and go to my Systems because I want to use my bones once again. And I'm actually going to start right in between these two bones because I'm going to create a pelvis. So I'm going to start with a pelvis, and we'll say that lives here, and we'll come up. And all I'm doing is clicking and dragging upwards, clicking and dragging upwards, clicking. And here I'm going to say pelvis, spine 01, spine 02, chest, and we'll say neck and head. And when I'm done, then I can just right click and we'll have a little nub. We don't need this nub, so we can delete it. And then if I want to adjust these bones, I definitely can. Some of them are a little, they're not quite straight. So if we wanted to go into Animation, Bone Tools, and turn our bone edit mode on, from here we can move our bones where we want to. We can do that, but all I really want to do is straighten them up. So I'm just going to click on a bone, go to my rotate in my world space, and just make sure that these are straight. So I'll click on the next one and make sure it's nice and straight. And keep going from there. So I'm just going to work my way up just to make sure these straight. Now, if you wanted them to be bent slightly to kind of mimic a real spine, then you're perfectly welcome to. So from here, I'm nice and straight. On my left side, I'm also straight. If I wanted to maybe give this a little bit of a bend to have more of a curvature in the back, then you're welcome to do that. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay, so we've got kind of a basic spine. And this would be a lot easier if we had a mesh that we could create our skeleton to mimic. But for what we're doing, just to learn how to create skeleton and create a custom rig and create controllers, then all of this will be just fine. Okay, so again, I've created it. I'm going to go in and name it. So I'll say this is my pelvis. And then maybe spine 01, spine 02, and I'm going to name this chest, neck, and head. Okay. So one of the first things I want to do is if we look at a real person and the way that their skeleton is connected, well, our pelvis, our legs are connected to our pelvis. So what happens with our pelvis is going to affect our leg, both of them. But if we look in our Scene Explorer, we can see that our legs are completely separate from the pelvis. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select both legs, and I can either do a select and link, or in my Scene Explorer with those two selected, I can just left click, hold, and drag that up to pelvis. And now they're children of the pelvis. So now if I were to move the pelvis, we should see that our legs bend. Okay? So now that we have this set up, I'm going to do some basic controls. The first thing I want to do is, and I'm going to go to my top view for the pelvis and chest and whatnot. I like to use circles. You're free to use whatever you want. I'm going to select a circle. I'm going to create it kind of big. And I want to make sure that my circle is in the same spot as my pelvis, so I'm going to align it here. So I'm going to select my circle, which is already selected, align to my pelvis, and I want the X, Y, and Z position. I don't want to mess with the rotation for the way that I like to do it. Okay, so from here, I'm going to make sure that I name this, and I'm going to say either pelvis control or hips control, whatever you want to call it. I would say that if you name the bone pelvis, then to name your control the same as the bone. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to link this pelvis bone to my controller. But I don't want to change my hierarchy, meaning in my Scene Explorer, I have my pelvis control. I don't want my pelvis to be a child of my pelvis control. And the reason why I don't want to do that is because I'm building this control just so I can animate it inside of 3ds Max. But if I were to bring it into a movie or especially a video game, if I export it for a video game, I don't want all these controls to export with it. So they can't be in the same hierarchy as my bones. Well, for the ease of what we're doing, we're going to say, just so we don't have to mess with any kind of special conditions, we're going to say that we're going to have two different hierarchies. We're going to have a hierarchy for the bones and a hierarchy for the controls. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my pelvis, and I'm going to give it, there's a couple of different ways that we can do it. For ease, I'm going to give it a position constraint and an orientation constraint. So position will allow me to move it, will allow my controller to control the position of it, and the orientation or rotation of the orientation or rotation of my pelvis. So I'm going to say my pelvis, animation constraint, position constraint, and I'm going to have it be controlled by this. So let's see, I believe, yep. So now if I move this controller, it controls my hips or my pelvis. Okay, then I'm going to again, pelvis, animation constraint, orientation constraint. Now this one's going to look broken when we connect it, and it's broken because it went 90 degrees on the Z and I believe Y axis, because this wasn't, we had it aligned in the position, but we didn't have anything aligned with our rotation. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to select the pelvis and go to our motion tab, and under orientation, we're going to tell it to keep initial offset, which is saying however it was rotated before you connect them, that's the way it needs to be rotated. So we can see that it went back to the upright position. Now we can move our controller, and we can also rotate our controller. And not only does it affect our pelvis, but because our legs are children of our pelvis, they will be affected as well. That's what we want. Okay, now I'm going to do kind of the same thing with the rest of them. So I'm going to, let's see, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm going to create 5 circles. Now there are many ways to do this. I'm just showing you one, and it may not be one that you know. It may not even be one that you like. That's okay. If you know different ways to do it, then please, do what you know. If you don't know anything about it, then this is one of many ways that we can do it. Okay. So I'm going to align this to my spine. Okay. Align this to my spinal 2. Okay. Align this to my chest. Okay. Align this to my neck. Sorry. And then align this to my head. And what I want to do is I want to make sure that I have everything named. So I'm going to name this Spine 01 Control to correspond with the name of the bone. Spine O2 control, chest control, neck control, and head control. All right, now we're going to do the same thing that we did with our pelvis with these other bones. So I'm going to select my spine bone. I'm going to animation constraint, position constraint. Do I want to do a position constraint? Let's do a position constraint. And then animation constraint, orientation constraint. And again, it's going to look like it breaks. And we'll just do that keep initial offset. And I'm going to go to each bone and do the same thing. Animation constraint, position constraint, animation constraint, orientation constraint. Keep initial offset. Now another thing that we could do if you wanted to, you could select one of those bones and let's see if this works. Animation constraint, link constraint. Okay. Now the issue there is that we moved down pretty far and we don't have a keep initial offset. There's nothing that we can really do without assigning more controllers, which we're not going to go over. So we're just going to Control Z. That's not going to work for us on this one. We'll just keep doing that position and orientation constraint. Position constraint, orientation constraint. And I do have a video going over each one of these constraints. So once you get comfortable with your constraints, you can kind of figure out which one is going to work best for you. So animation constraint, position constraint, animation constraint, orientation constraint, keep initial offset. And with our head, animation constraint, position constraint, animation constraint, orientation constraint, keep initial offset. Okay, and the more that you do this, the easier it's going to be. I can promise you that. So let's maybe, just for looks, I'm going to scale this in a little bit. Maybe scale this one in a little bit, but not quite as much. And that neck, definitely want it to be scaled in a little bit, and the head as well. So if we had a mesh and we wanted these controls to be on the outside of the mesh, then depending on how big our mesh is, we might have some kind of like a small waist and a more muscular chest, that type of thing. Now, what we should see here, if we rotate this, okay, so this will rotate, but the problem is that the ones above it will not. This bone here, we can move our bone. Well, rather, if we rotate it, those above it won't rotate. Well, it would help if I'm doing the control and not the bone itself. So the issue is that we have these bones are in a hierarchy, but our controls are not in a hierarchy. So if we move one, it's not affecting the other ones. So what I'm going to do is come back to my toggle scene explorer. And matter of fact, let's do it a little bit different way. Let's do the select and link. So I'm going to select this object here. Or matter of fact, I think I need to start from the head down. So I'm going to select and link. So I'm going to select my head and go to my neck. And now my head is a child of the neck. I'm going to say my neck is going to be a child of the chest. The chest is going to be a child of my spine 02. Spine 02 is going to be a child of spine 01. And spine 01 is going to be a child of hips. So now what we should see, if I rotate my spine 01 control, the rest of these should move with it because they're linked in the hierarchy. If I select all of these controls, they should all rotate individually, which they're not because I got to get that pelvis in there. Okay. Let's see if I do this locally. There we go. Okay. So now I can control them and they don't mess up like they were doing before where only one bone moved. So what we've done is we've gone through and we've created a spine. We've created controllers. The last thing I want to do is create what's called a look at constraint for my head. So I would have an object that wherever I move it, my head is looking at it. And this is good so we can, instead of having to always rotate this object to look at another object, we can do it automatically. So let's go to front view, and I'm going to create another circle. And I'm going to call this my head look at. Okay. And then I'm going to align it to my head. Okay. And then maybe move this out quite a bit. Move it out here. Then I'm going to choose this control here because this is the one that's controlling my head. And I'm going to say that head control, animation constraint, and I'm going to choose a look at constraint. And then I'm going to choose the shape that I made for my look at constraint. And again, I'm going to choose keep initial offset. And what we'll see, if I move this object here, we can see that my head is always looking at it. So that's really going to help us with our animation. And that's where we're going to stop today. We've created a spine, we've created the controllers, we've created a look at, and that's really, I would say, for what we're trying to do, a basic custom rig, this will work for us. So play around with that, get familiar with all of these things that we've been working with, controllers and constraints and bones, and just have fun.